Get your things and get out.
You're firing me.
Effective today. HR has the paperwork.
Because you don't know who you're actually firing, and you're about to find out.
Xavier didn't wait until they got home to tell her, and he didn't do it privately either. He walked straight up to her desk in the middle of the open office floor, planted both hands flat on the wood, and leaned in close enough that half the department could see exactly what was happening before he'd even said a word. Then he pointed, hard, toward the door across the room. "Get your things and get out," he said, loud enough that the floor around them went quiet. A dozen employees frozen mid-motion at their desks, watching. Bianca didn't move. She sat perfectly still, hands folded on the desk in front of her, and looked up at her husband of 10 years leaning over her like a man performing for an audience rather than delivering a decision he'd actually thought through. "You're firing me," she said. "Not a question." "Effective today," Xavier said, still pointing toward the door. "HR has the paperwork. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Xavier," Bianca said, and something in her voice made him stop, made him actually look at her instead of at the door behind him. "You should call your lawyer before you finish that sentence." He almost laughed, straightening up slightly, though his hand never left the desk. "Why would I need a lawyer to fire my own wife?" "Because you don't know who you're actually firing," she said, calm enough that a few of the nearest coworkers exchanged uneasy glances. "And you're about to find out." Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand exactly what Xavier didn't know standing in that doorway, you have to go back 6 years, to the worst month of Kessler Global's entire history, and a decision Bianca made that she never once told him about. Xavier and Bianca had been married 10 years by the time he fired her, together for 3 years before that. Meeting when Bianca was finishing her MBA and Xavier was 2 years into building what would eventually become Kessler Global, a logistics and freight technology company he'd started in a converted garage with 2 employees and a used delivery van he'd bought at auction. They met at a small business networking event Bianca had almost skipped, exhausted from a week of exams, talked into going by a classmate who promised free appetizers and nothing more ambitious than that. Xavier cornered her near the drink table within 20 minutes, launching into an explanation of his delivery routing software with an intensity that most people at a networking event would have found exhausting and that Bianca, to her own mild surprise, found she couldn't look away from. He was magnetic in those early years in the specific way founders often are, restless, talkative, absolutely convinced he was building something that mattered, a conviction that Bianca found genuinely compelling even when the actual numbers behind the company looked considerably shakier than his confidence suggested. She remembered visiting the actual garage about a month into dating him, expecting something closer to a proper office, and finding instead 2 folding tables, a whiteboard covered in route diagrams, and Xavier introducing her to his 2 employees with the same pride he might have shown off a Fortune 500 headquarters. She'd laughed about it later, gently, and he'd told her, completely serious, that this was exactly how every big company started, and that she should remember this garage once it became something. She went to work for a logistics consulting firm after finishing her MBA, building a career of her own that had nothing to do with Xavier's company for the first several years of their relationship, content to support him from the sidelines rather than involve herself directly in something that was, by every reasonable definition, entirely his. They married when she was 29, he was 31, a modest wedding that Xavier's business partner at the time joked would be the last thing either of them could afford for a while, a joke that turned out to be less funny than intended given how close Kessler Global actually came to collapsing less than 2 years later. The crisis, when it came, arrived the way most business crises do, not as a single dramatic event, but as a slow accumulation of bad news that finally reached a breaking point all at once. Kessler Global had grown fast, faster than its cash flow could comfortably support, expanding into 2 new regional markets on the strength of a bank line of credit that had seemed generous when Xavier signed it, and increasingly precarious as growth outpaced revenue. When the bank's own portfolio review flagged the account as higher risk than they'd initially modeled, they didn't just decline to extend additional credit. They called the existing line, giving Xavier 30 days to either repay it in full or find alternative financing, an ultimatum that arrived on a Tuesday morning and effectively meant the company had a month to either find several $1 million or shut its doors entirely. Xavier spent that month burning through every relationship he had, chasing investors who took meetings and then went quiet, chasing a second bank that ultimately declined for reasons that had everything to do with the first bank's decision becoming public knowledge in the small, gossipy world of regional business lending. Bianca watched him come home later and later, thinner and more hollowed out each week, watched a man who had never once, in 3 years together, let her see him genuinely frightened start to look exactly that. She remembered one night in particular, about 2 weeks into the 30-day window, finding him sitting on the edge of their bed at midnight, staring at nothing, a laptop with a rejection email still open on the screen beside him. "I might have to shut it down," he said, not looking up. "Lay off 19 people. Tell them Friday's their last day, and I don't have the money to give them more notice than that." She sat down beside him, not saying anything for a moment, watching him absorb a version of failure he'd clearly never let himself seriously imagine before that week. "What would you do?" he asked. "If it were you." "I'd keep looking," she said. "Right up until the deadline. You don't stop looking just because it feels hopeless." "It is hopeless," he said. "I've called everyone I know." "Then find someone you don't know yet," she said, and didn't tell him, that night or for 6 more years, that she was already quietly becoming exactly that person. What Xavier didn't know, and wouldn't learn for 6 more years, was that Bianca had spent that same month making a series of quiet, careful decisions of her own. Her father, who died 2 years before she met Xavier, had left her a modest but real inheritance, invested conservatively and left largely untouched, a financial cushion she'd never told Xavier the full size of, partly out of old habit and partly, she would admit to herself only much later, out of an instinct toward keeping something entirely her own even inside a marriage she was fully committed to. She spent that same month, quietly and separately from anything Xavier knew about, consulting with a corporate attorney named Malcolm Draper, a careful, methodical man who specialized in exactly the kind of structure she was describing, a way to invest in a company without her name ever appearing on the paperwork the company's own leadership would see. Draper set up a holding entity, Meridian Holdings, structured with enough legal distance and enough intermediary layers that when the investment eventually reached Kessler Global's bank account, it arrived looking like exactly what desperate, cash-strapped founders dream of finding in a crisis: an anonymous outside investment group willing to take a calculated risk on a company everyone else had already walked away from. Bianca liquidated nearly the entire inheritance, a sum large enough to fully satisfy the called line of credit with room left over for working capital, and authorized the transfer 11 days before Xavier's deadline, watching from a careful, deliberate distance as the news reached him through his own banker rather than through her. She remembered the night he came home and told her, disbelieving and euphoric in a way she hadn't seen from him in months, that some investment group calling itself Meridian Holdings had come through with exactly the amount they needed, structured as a straightforward equity investment in exchange for a substantial ownership stake. He paced their living room describing the call from his banker in vivid detail, replaying every word, still not quite able to believe it had actually happened. "They didn't even want to meet me first," he said. "No due diligence calls, no site visit, nothing. My banker said it's like they already knew everything they needed to know about the company." He shook his head, laughing in the disbelieving way people laugh when relief hits too fast to process normally. "Whoever these people are, they're either insane or they know something about this business that I don't. Maybe they just believed in what you built," Bianca said, watching him from the couch. "Nobody invests like that on belief alone," he said. "There's got to be someone behind Meridian who actually understands freight logistics. I'd love to know who." He asked her that night, half joking, whether she believed in miracles now. She told him she believed in him, which was true, and let him believe the rest of it was something else entirely. Kessler Global survived, then thrived, over the 6 years that followed, growing from a company that had nearly folded into a genuine regional logistics power, eventually expanding into 3 additional markets, and building a reputation Xavier was, understandably, deeply proud of. He talked about Meridian Holdings occasionally over those years, always with a kind of grateful curiosity about who exactly had taken that bet on him, mentioning more than once that he wished he could actually meet whoever ran the fund, just to shake their hand and tell them what that investment had actually meant. Bianca listened to those comments every time with the same carefully composed expression, offering nothing, volunteering nothing, understanding with each passing year how much stranger the eventual reveal would be the longer she waited to make it. She joined Kessler Global herself about 4 years into its recovery, initially as a part-time operations consultant helping streamline the regional expansion, a role that grew, gradually and without much fanfare, into a permanent mid-level position overseeing vendor relationships and supply chain logistics across 2 of the company's 4 markets. She was good at the job, genuinely good, respected by the people who worked directly with her, but she made a deliberate choice, year after year, to stay out of the executive spotlight Xavier occupied so naturally, declining opportunities for promotion that would have put her name and photo in the same company materials as his, telling herself it was simply a preference for substance over visibility. Her direct manager during those years, a longtime operations director named Felix Amaro, once told her, half joking during a performance review, that she was the most qualified person in the building who kept turning down every chance to prove it publicly. She'd laughed it off at the time, telling him she liked the work more than she liked the attention, which was true as far as it went, without being the entire truth. Some part of her, she would admit only much later, also understood that staying quietly positioned inside the company gave her a vantage point she wasn't yet ready to give up, a front row seat to exactly how the business actually ran beneath the version Xavier presented to investors and industry reporters. She used those years well, learning the company's operations with a depth that went considerably beyond what her formal title required, understanding vendor relationships and regional logistics patterns that even some of Xavier's own executives never fully grasped. It was knowledge she never spoke about publicly, filed away the same patient way she'd filed away everything else, though it would matter enormously, years later, in the smooth, unusually well-informed way she stepped into leadership once the board finally turned to her. The cracks in the marriage started showing about 8 years in, roughly 2 years before the firing, in ways that felt, at the time, more like ordinary marital drift than anything alarming. Xavier's hours grew longer, his attention at home grew thinner, a pattern Bianca initially attributed to the demands of running a company now 5 times the size it had been when they married. She noticed, gradually, a new name appearing in his conversation with increasing frequency. Nadia Ferris, a sharp, ambitious director he'd recruited from a competitor 2 years earlier to run business development, someone he described, at first, purely in professional terms, praising her instincts and her closing rate with the kind of enthusiasm that seemed reasonable enough for a talented new hire. The professional enthusiasm shifted, slowly and then unmistakably, into something else. Bianca noticed the late dinners described as client meetings that never appeared on any shared calendar. She noticed Xavier's phone face down more often than it used to be, a small habit that meant nothing in isolation and everything in the pattern it formed alongside a dozen other small habits accumulating over months. She didn't confront him immediately, partly because she genuinely wasn't certain yet, and partly because some old, careful instinct, the same one that had guided her through the Meridian Holdings decision 6 years earlier, told her that confirmation mattered more than confrontation, that acting before she fully understood the shape of what was happening would only cost her leverage she might need later. She found the confirmation she needed on a Thursday evening, 7 months before the firing, in the form of a text message that lit up Xavier's phone while he was in the shower, a message from Nadia that made the nature of their relationship entirely unambiguous within a single sentence. Bianca stood in the bedroom holding his phone for longer than she meant to, reading the message twice, feeling something settle into place that she realized, with a strange, distant clarity, she had already half expected for months. She set the phone back down exactly where she'd found it before he came out of the bathroom, and spent the rest of that evening behaving entirely normally, asking him about his day, discussing an upcoming vendor renewal over dinner, watching him lie to her by omission in 100 small ways across a conversation that would have looked, to anyone observing it, like an entirely ordinary Thursday between 2 people who'd been married for years. Bianca didn't confront him that night either. She sat with it for 3 full days, turning the discovery over with the same methodical patience she'd once applied to a company on the brink of collapse, understanding, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever came next needed to be approached carefully rather than emotionally if she wanted to protect herself fully. She thought, more than once during those 3 days, about how strange it was that the instinct guiding her now was the same instinct that had guided her through the Meridian Holdings decision 6 years earlier. The understanding that the version of herself capable of protecting what mattered most was never the version who reacted first. She consulted Malcolm Draper again, the same attorney who'd structured Meridian Holdings 6 years earlier, laying out the full situation, the affair, the marriage, her position at the company, and the ownership stake nobody at Kessler Global beyond Draper himself knew was actually hers. Draper reviewed the original Meridian Holdings documentation carefully and confirmed what Bianca had suspected but never fully verified. Over 6 years of continued reinvestment of dividends rather than cashing them out, her stake had grown from a substantial minority position into something considerably larger, a controlling interest that, combined with Kessler Global's own bylaws around shareholder disclosure triggered by significant employment actions involving executive-adjacent personnel, meant that any attempt to terminate her employment would very likely force exactly the disclosure she'd spent 6 years carefully avoiding. Draper's office hadn't changed much in 6 years. The same careful, unhurried manner, the same habit of reading through documents twice before offering an opinion on them. He listened to the full situation without interrupting, the affair, the marriage, her position at Kessler Global, letting Bianca lay out every piece before he responded. "I want to make sure I understand what you're actually asking me," he said finally. "Are you asking how to protect your ownership stake in a divorce? Or are you asking what happens if he fires you first?" "Both," Bianca said, "but mostly the second one." Draper pulled the original Meridian Holdings documentation from a drawer, along with 6 years of dividend reinvestment records he'd continued managing quietly on her behalf. "You understand what happens once this becomes public," Draper told her, in a conversation that felt less like legal advice and more like watching a door open onto a room she'd known existed but never actually walked into. "Once the company's counsel pulls the cap table to process any employment action against you, they're going to see Meridian Holdings, and they're going to see that Meridian Holdings is you. There's no version of firing you that doesn't lead directly there." Bianca understood exactly what that meant, and made a decision in that meeting that she carried quietly for the following 7 months, waiting rather than acting, not because she was uncertain about what she wanted, but because she understood, with the same patience that had once saved the company itself, that Xavier firing her rather than her leaving on her own terms would give her a cleaner, more complete legal and narrative position than anything she could construct by walking away first. She didn't have to wait particularly long. Xavier's relationship with Nadia deepened over those 7 months in ways that made Bianca's continued presence at the company, and in his life more broadly, an increasingly obvious inconvenience to him. He started finding reasons to minimize her role in meetings she'd previously led. He started routing decisions through other channels that had once gone through her. There was an especially telling moment about 4 months into the waiting period. At a quarterly planning meeting Bianca had run for 3 consecutive years, when Xavier announced, without warning or prior discussion, that Nadia would be taking over the vendor strategy presentation going forward. Bianca sat through the rest of that meeting watching her own work handed to someone else in real time, offering no visible reaction, filing the moment away the same way she'd filed away small things for years. Afterward, in the hallway, Xavier caught up to her and offered an explanation that didn't quite hold together. "I just think it's good for Nadia to get more visibility," he said. "You've had your time in that role. It might be good to let someone else grow into it." "Of course," Bianca said. "Whatever's best for the company." He seemed relieved by how easily she let it go, not understanding that her calm had nothing to do with acceptance and everything to do with patience running its course exactly as planned. By the 6th month, it had become clear to Bianca, watching from the careful, patient distance she'd maintained the entire time, that Xavier was building towards some kind of resolution, and that the resolution he had in mind almost certainly involved her no longer being part of either his company or his life. She noticed him having closed-door conversations with HR that stopped abruptly whenever she walked past. She noticed Nadia's presence in leadership meetings growing more prominent by the week, occupying space that had once been Bianca's without anyone ever formally announcing the shift. The restructuring announcement came 3 weeks before the actual firing, framed to the broader staff as a routine reorganization of the operations division, A plausible enough cover story that most employees accepted at face value. Felix Amaro, Bianca's manager and one of the only people at the company who genuinely understood the depth of her contributions over the years, pulled her aside after the announcement meeting, visibly troubled. "This doesn't add up," he told her quietly, in the hallway outside the conference room. "Your division's numbers are the strongest in the company. If anyone's role should be safe, it's yours." "I know," Bianca said. "Do you want me to say something? Push back on this?" "No," she said. "Let it happen exactly the way it's happening. I promise you it's going to make sense eventually." Felix studied her for a long moment, clearly unsatisfied with the answer but recognizing, from years of working alongside her, that Bianca rarely said something without a fully formed reason behind it. He didn't push further. He simply told her, before they parted ways that afternoon, that whatever was actually going on, he trusted her judgment more than he trusted anything coming out of the executive floor lately. Bianca watched the restructuring unfold with a clear understanding of where it was ultimately headed, declining to preemptively resign or make the process easier for him in any way, understanding that every day she remained an employee was a day closer to the disclosure she'd been quietly waiting 6 years to trigger. The firing itself, when it finally happened, unfolded exactly the way Bianca had come to expect from a man increasingly comfortable treating her as an obstacle rather than a partner. Abrupt, procedural, delivered with an audience present specifically so word would spread through the company quickly. What Xavier didn't understand, leaning over her desk in front of the entire floor delivering a decision he believed was entirely his to make, was that he had just triggered the exact disclosure requirement Draper had warned Bianca about 7 months earlier, and that the paperwork already moving through HR and legal would reach the company's general counsel within hours, not days. Xavier's first indication that something had gone badly wrong came less than 4 hours after he left Bianca's office, when Kessler Global's general counsel, a careful, no-nonsense woman named Foster, requested an urgent, private meeting that afternoon. Xavier arrived expecting a routine conversation about severance terms, and instead found Foster sitting across from him with the company's cap table printed and highlighted, sliding it across the desk with an expression that told him, before she said a single word, that whatever was coming was not going to be routine. "Meridian Holdings," Foster said, tapping the highlighted line, "has held a controlling interest in this company for the past 4 years. As of this morning, our filings show that interest is held by a trust naming Bianca Kessler as sole beneficiary and controlling party." She let that sit for a moment before continuing. "You didn't just fire an employee this afternoon. You fired the majority shareholder of this company, and under Section 7 of our own bylaws, any employment action affecting a controlling shareholder requires board ratification you didn't seek and almost certainly wouldn't have received." Xavier sat with that information the way a man sits with news that rearranges every assumption he's built a decade of his life on top of. He asked Foster, voice unsteady, whether there was some mistake, some other explanation, and watched her shake her head with the patient, unmistakable certainty of someone who had already triple-checked the filing before ever walking into the room. He thought, in the disoriented minutes that followed, about every conversation he'd ever had about Meridian Holdings, the gratitude, the curiosity about who ran the fund, the offhand comment about wanting to shake their hand, and understood, with a nausea that had nothing to do with the business implications, exactly whose hand he'd been talking about shaking for 6 years without ever knowing it. He called Bianca that evening, and she let it go to voicemail 3 times before finally answering on the 4th call, her voice as calm as it had been standing over that desk that morning. "I think we should talk," he said. "We are talking," she said. "You just don't like what I'm saying." "You could have told me," he said. 6 years, Bianca. You let me think some strangers saved my company. I let you believe what you wanted to believe, she said. You never asked me directly. Not once, in 6 years, did you ask your own wife whether she might have had anything to do with it. You went looking for a stranger to thank because it never once occurred to you the answer might be sitting across the breakfast table from you every single morning. She paused. That tells you something about how you saw me, Xavier, long before you ever fired me from a job I never actually needed. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. This afternoon, he said finally, in your office. If I'd known, would you have told me? If I just asked? I don't know, Bianca said honestly. I like to think I would have, eventually, on my own terms, when it felt right rather than forced. But you didn't give me that choice today. You made a decision about my life without asking me a single question first. The same way you've been making decisions without asking me questions for longer than you probably realize. I just happened to have an answer waiting that you weren't prepared for. He didn't have a response to that. The call ended a few minutes later, neither of them having said anything that resembled reconciliation, both of them, in different ways, already understanding that whatever came next would look nothing like the marriage either of them had started with. The board meeting that followed, called on an emergency basis 4 days later, was the first time Xavier had ever sat in a Kessler Global conference room as anything other than the person clearly in charge of the room. He arrived early, alone, taking his usual seat at the head of the table out of pure habit before catching himself and moving to a different chair once he realized how it would look. Bianca arrived 12 minutes later with Malcolm Draper beside her, calm and composed in a way that unsettled several board members more than open hostility would have. She didn't raise her voice once during the presentation that followed. She walked the board through the Meridian Holdings documentation methodically, the same way she might once have walked through a vendor contract, laying out 6 years of dividend history and the legal basis for her controlling stake without a single note of triumph in her delivery. When she finished, one of the longer-tenured board members, a woman named Priscilla Okafor who'd sat on Kessler Global's board since its second funding round, asked the question everyone in the room seemed to be silently holding. "Why now?" Okafor asked. "You've held this position for years. Why bring it forward at this particular moment?" "Because he fired me without ever once asking who I actually was," Bianca said. "I didn't create this situation. I simply stopped protecting him from it." Xavier, given the opportunity to respond, offered an explanation about restructuring and operational efficiency that grew visibly thinner the longer he spoke. Several board members exchanging glances that made clear the explanation wasn't landing the way he needed it to. Draper, when his turn came, raised, separately from the ownership issue itself, a pattern of decision-making the board's own outside counsel had already begun quietly investigating. Expense irregularities connected to Nadia's department, personnel decisions that appeared to favor her professionally in ways inconsistent with company policy, a pattern that the board's own counsel later described. In a private memo Xavier eventually saw during discovery, as increasingly erratic and personally motivated rather than business-driven. The board did not reinstate Bianca to her former mid-level role. They did something considerably larger, voting within 6 weeks to restructure Kessler Global's leadership entirely, installing Bianca as interim CEO while a permanent search was conducted, a decision driven as much by her controlling ownership stake as by the board's own accumulated concerns about Xavier's recent conduct, concerns that predated the firing and had simply lacked a clear catalyst until Bianca's stake became public. Xavier remained on the board itself, a concession his own attorneys negotiated as part of the broader settlement. But the company he had built from a converted garage and a used delivery van was, within 2 months of firing his wife, no longer his to run. Bianca filed for divorce 3 weeks after the board meeting, a process complicated considerably by the tangled overlap between their marital assets and her now public ownership stake, requiring months of careful legal untangling that neither of them found particularly pleasant, but that both of them, by every account that later became public through the proceedings, approached without any real appetite for reconciliation. Draper handled the divorce alongside the corporate matters, navigating a settlement that kept Bianca's Meridian Holdings stake entirely separate from the marital estate, a distinction his original 6-year-old structuring had anticipated with a foresight neither of them had fully appreciated until it actually mattered. Xavier's attorneys pushed hard, in the early months of the divorce proceedings, for a narrative that painted Bianca's silence about Meridian Holdings as its own form of deception, an argument that gained little traction once the actual timeline became clear in discovery. A wife who had quietly saved her husband's company at genuine personal financial risk, never once used that leverage against him for 6 years, and only stepped forward once he'd fired her from a job she never needed in the first place. The judge overseeing the proceedings noted, in a preliminary ruling that later circulated among business journalists covering the story, that Xavier's argument asked the court to treat generosity as manipulation simply because it had eventually proven inconvenient to him. Xavier's relationship with Nadia, which had been the accelerant behind the entire firing in the first place, didn't survive the fallout either. Nadia resigned from Kessler Global within weeks of Bianca's ownership becoming public, uncomfortable remaining at a company now controlled by the wife of the man she'd been involved with, taking a position at a competitor where she could, in her own words to a mutual former colleague, just do my job without being part of someone else's story. The relationship between Nadia and Xavier itself dissolved not long after her resignation, undone by the same pressure and scrutiny that had exposed it in the first place, both of them discovering, once the initial drama settled, that whatever had drawn them together hadn't been built to survive this much daylight. When people who knew them both asked Bianca, in the months following the divorce, whether she thought there was any version of events where she and Xavier eventually found their way back to something resembling reconciliation, she told them, consistently, and without room for further discussion, that she didn't see one, and that she wasn't looking for one. She would say, if pressed further, that's 6 years of watching a man thank a stranger for saving his life's work, while standing 3 feet away from the person who'd actually done it had taught her something about the marriage that no amount of reconciliation could fully undo. Bianca served as interim CEO for 8 months before the board made the position permanent, leading Kessler Global through a leadership transition that industry observers later described as unusually smooth given the circumstances, a stability she attributed, when asked, to having understood the company's actual operations more intimately than anyone realized for years before she ever held a formal executive title. Her first major decision as interim CEO was quietly promoting Felix Amaro, her old manager, to a senior operations role, a decision she made entirely on merit and one that happened, as a side benefit, to put someone she trusted completely in a position close to her own. The employees who'd worked alongside her for years, the ones who'd known her only as a capable, low-key colleague in vendor relations, took time adjusting to the new reality of her sitting at the head of the same conference table Xavier once occupied. Several told reporters, once the story broke publicly, that the adjustment was less jarring than they expected, because the version of Bianca now running meetings wasn't a different person than the one they'd worked beside for years, simply the same steady, thorough competence, now finally given the room to operate at full scale. Felix Amaro, sitting in the audience the day the board formally announced her as permanent CEO, would say later that watching her take that stage felt less like witnessing a surprise and more like watching something click into a place it had probably always belonged. He remembered the hallway conversation from months earlier, her calm insistence that everything happening would eventually make sense, and understood, finally, exactly what she'd meant by it. She rebuilt her personal life slowly and privately, moving into a home of her own that had nothing to do with the one she'd shared with Xavier, declining most interview requests that tried to frame her story primarily around the marriage rather than the business decisions that had actually driven the outcome. The few interviews she did agree to, she steered deliberately toward operational strategy and industry trends, uninterested in becoming a cautionary tale or a viral moment, understanding that the version of her story that mattered most to her own sense of the last 6 years had very little to do with Xavier at all. Xavier's remaining months on the Kessler Global board were, by every account that later became public, deeply uncomfortable ones, sitting quarterly across the same conference table from a woman he'd once dismissed as easily replaceable, watching her run the company he'd built with a confidence and command he'd never once seen from her during the 10 years he'd assumed he understood exactly who she was. He rarely spoke during those board meetings beyond what was procedurally necessary, several attendees later recalled, a stark contrast to the man who had once dominated every conversation in that same room without effort. He remained on the Kessler Global board for just under a year before stepping down entirely, taking a position at a smaller logistics startup where he could once again be the primary founder story rather than a cautionary one, a transition several former colleagues described, in interviews conducted long after, as clearly difficult for a man who had spent a decade being the most important person in every room he entered. The new company was smaller, scrappier, closer in size to what Kessler Global had been in its earliest years, and Xavier threw himself into it with an intensity that people who knew him well read less as passion than as a man trying to outrun a version of his own story he couldn't fully escape. He never publicly discussed the specifics of what had happened with Meridian Holdings, though the broader outline of the story circulated widely enough in industry circles that he rarely needed to. At networking events for years afterward, he would occasionally notice a flicker of recognition cross someone's face when his name came up alongside Kessler Global's. A brief, awkward pause before the conversation moved on, and he learned, eventually, to simply steer conversations away from that chapter of his career entirely rather than address it directly. If you asked Bianca today what she took from those 6 years of careful, quiet patience, she wouldn't tell you it was a lesson about revenge, a framing she rejected clearly and consistently whenever anyone tried to apply it to her story. She would tell you it was a lesson about the specific, durable power of simply being underestimated by someone who never thought to ask a single honest question about who she actually was, and about how much of that power a person can quietly hold on to, for years if necessary, until the exact moment it finally matters. She kept the original Meridian Holdings paperwork Draper had drawn up 6 years earlier, long after any practical need to reference it had passed, tucked away in a drawer of her new home office rather than displayed anywhere visible. She wasn't entirely sure, even years later, why she'd held on to it rather than simply letting the files live wherever corporate records eventually settle. The closest she ever came to explaining it, in a rare unguarded moment during one of the few interviews she agreed to, was that the paperwork had been the first proof she ever had of her own capacity to protect something enormous without needing anyone's permission or approval to do it. Evidence, in the end, not just of what she'd built, but of exactly what she was capable of when everything depended on her staying patient enough to see it through. A little over 3 years after the board meeting that changed everything, Kessler Global posted its strongest quarterly results in company history, a milestone Bianca marked privately rather than publicly, declining the board's suggestion of a press event built around the achievement. She preferred, by then, to let the numbers speak on their own, the same quiet preference for substance over spotlight that had once made her easy for Xavier to overlook, and that had, in the end, turned out to be exactly the thing that let her outlast him. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Psyche Tales TV for more stories about the quiet power people build when they're never fully seen for who they are, and tell us in the comments whether you think Bianca should have told Xavier the truth sooner, or whether waiting was exactly the right call. Before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.